There is a shot near the end of regular show, in the finale, where Pops is watching an old VHS tape by himself, somewhere that looks a little like heaven, and the tape is labeled simply regular show. He rewinds it, he fast forwards it. He watches his friends the way you might watch home movies of people you love who are still, somewhere, going on living without you. Almost nobody talks about this shot as loudly as they talk about the hug, or the sun, or the 20-year time skip that follows it. But it might be the strangest single image in the entire series, because it means that everything we ever watched, every slacked shift, every video game tournament, every cosmic near apocalypse solved by a game of ping pong, was already being watched by someone else the whole time. Tonight we are going through every conspiracy that has ever grown up around regular show, not just the famous ones, all of them, the ones the wiki calls canon, the ones that live only in old forum threads, the ones that only started making sense once the show, against every possible expectation, came back this year with new episodes framed as tapes. Pops never got to watch the first time around. I am Velvo, and this video exists to help you fall asleep, so get comfortable, turn the lights down low, and let's walk back into the park together. The oldest and biggest reading of regular show, the one almost everybody arrives at within a season or two of really paying attention, is that the park itself is not a normal place. On paper, the premise could not be simpler. Two 20-something slackers, a blue jay named Mordecai and a raccoon named Rigby, work as groundskeepers at a public park owned by a strict older man and managed day to day by a bad-tempered walking gumball machine named Benson. They avoid work. They get sent on small errands. The errands escalate, almost without fail, into some kind of cosmic confrontation with an entity that wants to end the world over a video game high score, or a missed deadline, or a bet gone wrong. And by the end of the episode, the universe has been saved, and nothing has really changed, and the loop resets for next week. That is the version of the show a person could describe in a single sentence. The reading that has stuck to regular show since its earliest seasons is that the park is something closer to a waiting room. Not heaven exactly, not hell, not purgatory in the strict religious sense fans sometimes reach for, but a threshold, a holding pattern, a place where unfinished people stay until they work out what they actually want. Once you look at the show through that lens, nearly every character reorganizes itself in front of you. Mordecai and Rigby are dead-end 20-somethings stuck repeating something close to the same week. Benson, their boss, is a middle manager who is furious in a way that reads, the longer you watch him, less like anger and more like the specific frustration of someone who senses there is an exit somewhere he can't quite locate. Skips is an immortal groundskeeper who has been there for well over a century, moving through the world by skipping rather than walking, which the show plays as a running joke for years before it ever explains why. Pops is, we eventually learn, not from Earth at all. Muscle Man wears the same outfit every single day of his life. High Five Ghost is, without any drama or explanation, already dead. None of this is stated outright anywhere in the show. That's important to say plainly, because it's the difference between what the show confirms and what fans have built on top of what the show confirms. The wiki does not stamp the park as purgatory, reading as canon, and the show never has a character sit down and explain it. But the way the show treats time, the way characters die and come back with almost no lasting consequence, the way nobody in the cast ages meaningfully across 8 years of episodes, even as pop culture and technology shift underneath them, the way the park itself seems to bend whenever the plot needs it to bend, All of it accumulates into a pattern that becomes very hard to unsee once you've seen it. What a lot of longtime fans land on is the idea that regular show is not, underneath its premise, a workplace comedy. It's a comedy about people who don't yet know they are between two versions of their own lives. The quiet tragedy that gets louder the further into the series you go is that some of them figure that out and grow past it, and some of them very nearly don't. Before we go any further, if you're watching this right now, drop a comment with where you're watching from and what time it is on your clock. I like knowing where these videos end up. Somewhere in the world, it's the middle of the afternoon, and somewhere else, it's 3 in the morning, and somebody's phone brightness is turned all the way down, so it doesn't wake anyone up. Let me know which one you are tonight. Underneath that first theory, and running quietly through almost everything else the show ever does, is the question of what Pops actually is. On the surface, he's a sweet, slightly senile grown man with a lollipop for a head who lives in a mansion with his father, talks to himself, and gets gently confused by the ordinary mechanics of the world. He does no visible work. He seems to exist mostly as comic relief and emotional warmth. Then, in the back half of the final season, the show does something that genuinely surprised its longtime audience. It reveals that Pops is not human, was never human, and is in fact a being called Megachronus, one half of a cosmic pair born to maintain the balance of the entire universe. His counterpart, his identical brother, is a dark, armored, mustached figure the show refers to as Anti-Pops, whose true name is revealed to be Malum Cranus. According to the show's own mythology, delivered through the natives of Pops's homeworld, Lollyland, Pops was created as the embodiment of pure good, and Anti-Pops came into being afterward as his opposite, born specifically to keep the universe in balance. Every time the two of them have fought across the eons, the fight has ended in a stalemate, a mutual knockout that resets the universe and wipes their memories over and over for what the show implies is billions of cycles. This is documented plainly by the wiki and confirmed on screen in the 3-part series finale, a regular epic final battle. It isn't speculation, it's the text of the show. What is speculation, clearly labeled as such, is everything fans have built around that reveal. The moment you learn what Pops actually is, the earlier seasons start to feel different in hindsight. Why does he live in a mansion nobody else seems to own outright? Why does Mr. Maillard, the harsh, impatient businessman who owns the park and treats his staff like they're barely worth his attention, dote on Pops like he's the most precious thing in the world? The fan reading that lines up cleanly with the canon reveal is that Pops was placed on Earth deliberately, hidden inside an ordinary life, raised by Mr. Maillard as a son, kept gentle and unaware, because the moment he remembered what he actually was, the universe would have to settle its oldest and most dangerous unfinished business. Read that way, the entire show becomes the story of a delay. Every silly errand, every video game tournament, every awkward attempt at a date, every afternoon spent doing nothing much at all, is one more day where Pops gets to be sweet and confused instead of being a god at war with the other half of himself. Some fans push this further into something closer to a full conspiracy, and the show does not confirm it, but it does seem to nod at it, the idea that the entire park exists to shelter him. The job, the staff, the gumball machine boss, the Yeti groundskeeper, the slacker birds, the green man, the ghost, all of it functioning, whether anyone in it realizes it or not, as camouflage. By that reading, Mr. Maillard didn't build a park. He built a hiding place, and the people working inside it are the ones strange enough, oblivious enough, or strong enough to keep the secret without ever knowing they're keeping it. Close to canon, but still spoken about mostly as fan interpretation because of how far its implications reach, is the theory surrounding Skips. Skips is the park's Yeti groundskeeper, its unofficial elder and fixer. He can repair almost anything. He seems to know almost everything. He almost never sits down, and instead of walking, he skips everywhere, which the show treats for years as a small, slightly sad running joke before finally explaining it. His real name, we learn in the season 5 episode Skip's Story, is Walks. As a teenager at a school called Bennett High, sometime in the 19th century, according to the show's own internal, somewhat playful timeline, Walks fell in with a group called the Guardians of Eternal Youth, immortal cosmic beings who, at that point, were simply a clique of powerful students. He fell in love with a girl named Desdemona, called Mona, who taught him to be gentler, who disapproved of fighting, and who eventually convinced him to give up violence entirely. The school's resident bully was Clorgbane the Destroyer, the Guardian's own villainous brother, and when Clorgbane could no longer be avoided, the confrontation happened at prom. Clorgbane attacked Walks with a mace. Mona pushed him out of the way to save him, and a section of the ceiling collapsed and killed her instantly. Devastated, and now armed with a pair of magical gauntlets called the Fists of Justice, Walks defeated Clorgbane and sent him hurtling into orbit. Afterward, when the Guardians of Eternal Youth offered him immortality so he could keep fighting Clorgbane every 157 years, the number the show attaches to the villain's return, Walks accepted, and when asked to choose a new name to be reborn under, he thought of the way he and Mona used to skip together across the school grounds, and chose Skips. Every footfall since then, according to the show's own text, has been Skips refusing to walk again because walking is what he was doing on the day he met her. This entire backstory is canon. It's documented on the wiki in detail, and it's staged by the show as one of the most quietly devastating episodes in the whole run. What fans have built on top of that canon is where things move from fact into interpretation. The theory goes that Skips is not simply a long-lived character who happens to work at this particular park. He's something closer to the park's actual guardian, the reason it has survived as long as it has. He has buried friends. He has stood at the edge of cosmic events that, by any reasonable logic, should have erased the place a dozen times over, and yet the park is still there. Some fans extend the reading further, and this part is pure speculation with no textual confirmation, suggesting that Skips knew exactly what Pops was for the entire run of the show and simply never said anything, because Pops needed to be allowed to be Pops for as long as that was possible. Nothing in the show delivers this as a monologue. Skips never breaks and explains himself. But the way the show frames his silences, the quiet, patient fondness with which he watches Pops across 8 seasons, the fact that he is almost never genuinely surprised by anything, all of it reads to attentive fans like the behavior of someone who already knows how the story ends and has chosen, out of love, to let everyone else discover it in their own time. A related reading, one that started as a running joke and slowly stopped being just a joke as the seasons piled up, concerns Benson. Benson is angry. He is almost constantly angry, and the show plays him for years as a stressed middle manager whose 2 worst employees also happen to be his 2 main characters. But somewhere around the 3rd season, fans started noticing something underneath the yelling. The interpretation, and it remains an interpretation rather than anything the show states outright, is that Benson is not merely frustrated. He's the one member of the staff who senses, without ever being able to say so directly, that something about the park is fundamentally wrong, or at least fundamentally not what it appears to be. There are storylines across the series where Benson tries to quit, or nearly gets a different job, and he always ends up back at the park regardless. The reading some fans have taken from this is that he's not allowed to know the full shape of what's happening beneath the surface of the place he manages. He's simply allowed to feel the weight of it, which is arguably a lonelier position than knowing outright. There's a recurring beat across the series where Benson, in the middle of yelling at Mordecai and Rigby, gets a look on his face that reads less like anger and more like dread. The look of someone who has begun to suspect his own routine isn't as ordinary as it should be. It's worth being honest that this reading is built almost entirely on inference and performance rather than dialogue, but it's a durable one in the fandom precisely because it reframes his hardest scenes, especially in the finale, where an older Benson finally inherits the park itself after Mr. Maylord's death and gets the quiet, stable life fans had long hoped for him. High Five Ghost gives us one of the show's simplest facts, stated as almost a throwaway joke. He's called Fives by his friends, and he is, without any explanation ever offered, a ghost. He's been dead for the entire run of the series. Nobody in the cast treats this as strange. Nobody asks how he died. He floats around holding up his hand for high fives that mostly go unreturned, and he lives a small, warm, embodied feeling life, despite technically having no body. He's voiced, worth noting clearly here since it's a detail that sometimes gets mixed up online, not by Sam Marin, who voices Benson, Pops, and Muscle Man, but by series creator J.G. Quintel himself, the same actor who voices Mordecai. That's a documented fact of the show's production, not speculation. The conspiracy that has grown up around High Five Ghost is that his casual presence at the park is some of the clearest proof available that the park isn't a normal place at all. Living characters and a dead one work side by side without anyone finding it remarkable, which some fans read as a quiet signal to the audience. If you can accept that one of the main characters is dead, you can accept that this place operates by different rules than the world outside its fence. The unconfirmed, more speculative version of this reading is that High Five Ghost remembers exactly how he died and simply chooses not to discuss it, because doing so would break something for the people around him. What's documented and not speculative is that by the time of the finale, he's shown to be one of the most stable and contented members of the entire cast, in a relationship with a girlfriend named Celia, and the two of them are shown afterward touring together as party DJs. The gentle argument some fans draw from that outcome, and it is only a reading, is that being dead in the universe of regular show might genuinely be easier, in some ways, than being alive in it. Muscle Man is the character who has produced more conspiracy theories per square inch than almost anyone else in the cast, and a lot of that comes down to how carefully the show plays the gap between how he presents himself and who he actually turns out to be. His real name is Mitch Sorenstein. He's short and round, not the towering, muscular figure his name implies, and he spends the entire series performing a kind of exaggerated toughness that never quite matches his actual body or his actual heart, because underneath the performance he cries easily and loves deeply. He built his whole identity around the memory of his father, a man everyone in the show calls Muscle Dad, and this is where a detail from the show's own text quietly undercuts the more romantic version of the legend fans sometimes tell. In the Season 3 episode, Trucker Hall of Fame, it's revealed on screen that Muscle Dad wasn't actually the mythic trucker Muscle Man grew up believing him to be. He was a forklift operator who faked a photograph of himself in a truck and told his son he was a long-haul trucker, specifically so Muscle Man would be proud of him. His dying note, read by Muscle Man after he discovers the deception, explains that he lied because he wanted to toughen his son up for a hard world, and asks him to scatter his hat's ashes at the Trucker Hall of Fame as one last prank against the real truckers who look down on him for driving a forklift. It's a small, oddly moving reveal, and it means the legend Muscle Man has spent his whole adult life performing was itself already a performance one generation earlier. The fan theory that grows out of that fact, and this part is interpretation rather than anything the show states directly, is that Muscle Man is the show's clearest thesis statement about the gap between the self a person presents and the self underneath it. Because it turns out that gap runs at least 2 generations deep in his family. He calls himself Muscle Man despite having no visible muscle. He insists he's tough despite crying at the smallest provocation. And the myth he's been chasing his entire life belonged, it turns out, to a father who was also chasing a myth. The reading some fans land on is that his growth across the series, particularly after his father's funeral and later his own marriage to Starla and the birth of their children, is about learning to hold on to the love underneath the performance, even after the performance itself has been exposed as false. One of the more underrated corners of the fandom concerns the power, an old, slightly absurd looking electric keyboard that Mordecai and Rigby find in the attic of the house they live in early in the show's run. The first time they play it, they discover it can, on some level, bend reality. They use it for small tricks and to skip work before eventually using it to help save the world more than once. Then, quietly, the show mostly stops using it as a centerpiece and folds it into the wider background mythology of the park without ever fully explaining its origin, though it does return in a meaningful way in the finale, where it's ultimately destroyed during the fight between Pops and Anti-Pops. That unexplained gap is exactly where the conspiracy lives. Fans have theorized for years that the power was never just a magical instrument that happened to end up in an attic. The argument, entirely speculative and never confirmed by the wiki or the show itself, is that the power predates the park, predates Pops, predates Skips, and was left there deliberately, waiting for the right pair of slackers to stumble onto it. Some fans push this even further, suggesting the power is connected directly to the cosmic imbalance between Pops and Anti-Pops, functioning as a kind of stabilizer left behind for the day their war finally broke open in earnest. Nothing in the show confirms this, but it's genuinely striking, on a rewatch, how reverent the series gets whenever the power appears, how characters who normally treat the supernatural as a minor Tuesday inconvenience get quiet around it. The smallest, most speculative version of this reading is the one that sticks with people the longest, that the power was meant for Pops the whole time and Mordecai and Rigby were simply the two who happened to find it first. Closely tied to all of this is a long-running argument among fans that Mordecai's romantic indecision functions as something like a structural force inside the show's own metaphysics. On the surface, Mordecai is a blue jay in his 20s who works a dead-end job and spends his free time playing video games with his best friend. Underneath that, he's a young man who has an enormous amount of trouble making a decision and sticking with it. The show spends a huge portion of its runtime on his relationship with Margaret, a Robin who works at the local coffee shop, and later on his relationship with CJ, a cloud being he meets partway through the series, and then on the long, messy back and forth between the two of them, full of moments where Mordecai picks one and almost immediately regrets it. The fan reading offered clearly as interpretation rather than anything textually confirmed, is that his indecision isn't simply a personal flaw sitting quietly in the background of the plot. It's treated as though it has weight in the world itself, since so many of the show's biggest cosmic set pieces land during or right after moments when Mordecai is avoiding an honest conversation about what he actually wants. The argument some fans make is that giant, rampaging monsters and reality warping villains aren't just random plot generators dropped in for comedic escalation. They're read as an externalization of a young man's refusal to be honest with himself about his own feelings. It's a poetic reading more than a proven one, but it lines up with how relentlessly the show does tie his emotional arc to its centerpiece episodes. And the takeaway a lot of longtime viewers land on is that the show's quiet argument about growing up isn't that you have to pick the right person, it's that you have to become someone capable of picking at all. Margaret and CJ deserve to be considered as a pair because the two of them together form one of the cleanest examples in the entire show of how it uses ordinary relationship drama to seed something larger. Margaret is grounded, ambitious, ordinary in the best sense of the word, working her way toward journalism school across the series and eventually leaving the park to pursue it, a storyline the show treats with more seriousness than most workplace sitcoms extend to a supporting love interest. CJ is a literal cloud being, capable of changing shape and, when she's upset, of bringing actual weather with her. The contrast between the two of them is almost too neat to be accidental, and the reading many fans have settled on, offered here as interpretation rather than stated fact, is that Margaret and CJ aren't really two separate love interests, so much as two halves of a single unresolved question. Mordecai keeps being asked across the show's run, does he want the steady, plannable life, or does he want the life that feels most intensely alive to him in the moment, even when it's unstable? What the show does confirm, and this is documented plainly, is that in the finale, after the 20-year time skip, Mordecai ends up with neither of them. He becomes a successful painter and marries a bat named Steph, a character the audience has never met before that moment. And the choice to end his arc with someone entirely new rather than resolving the old love triangle produced years of fan debate that, honestly, still hasn't fully settled. The reading that a lot of fans have found the most convincing, again purely an interpretation, is that the show is being quietly honest about something true for a lot of people. That the person you spend your 20s agonizing over is often not the person you eventually build a life with, and that the real work of growing up is becoming someone capable of being loved steadily by whoever does eventually show up. Mr. Maillard is one of the most underexamined characters in the entire series, and by the time the show ends, most of the theories fans built around him have effectively become canon. He's the wealthy, impatient, often harsh owner of the park, quick to yell at Benson, dismissive of cosmic disasters as long as the books balance, and yet he treats Pops with a tenderness that fits nowhere else in his personality. Once the finale reveals what Pops actually is, Mr. Maillard's decades of behavior recontextualize themselves almost completely. The reading the show clearly supports, though it never states it in a single line of dialogue, is that this is a man who spent his entire adult life pretending to be a hard-nosed businessman precisely so his son could have something resembling a normal childhood. He built and maintained the park, weathered catastrophe after catastrophe, and did all of it, according to this reading, as cover. The more speculative version some fans hold, one the show gestures toward without ever confirming outright, is that Mr. Maylard knew exactly what Pops was from the very beginning and simply never told him, choosing instead to love a child he understood was destined for a fight nobody could guarantee he'd survive. What is documented as canon is his death near the very end of the series, sometime before the 25th anniversary reunion shown in the epilogue, and Benson's inheritance of the park in his memory, complete with a statue erected for him beside the one built for Pops. Read against everything that came before it. It's hard not to see him as one of the saddest and most quietly heroic characters the show ever built. The space arc, which dominates the back half of the series, is a conspiracy of a slightly different kind, because part of the mystery isn't just about what happens on screen, it's about what happened behind the scenes to produce it. The simple, documented fact is that somewhere in its later seasons, regular show takes a hard turn into outright science fiction. The park is physically lifted off Earth and turned into a dome-covered ship. The cast becomes fugitives fleeing across the galaxy. The threats escalate from local weirdness to full cosmic warlords, and the tone, while still funny, becomes noticeably more serialized and more emotionally invested in long-form storytelling than the earlier seasons ever were. This shift is documented plainly, including by creator J.G. Quintel himself in interviews given around the time of the finale, where he's discussed how the show was given a defined ending point, and the writers used that knowledge to escalate everything that mattered to them before the clock ran out. What remains speculative, because there's no clean way to verify it, is the fan theory that the original plan for the series stretched further than what eventually aired, and that the space arc compresses what would have been several additional years of storytelling into a handful of seasons. What isn't speculative is that nothing about the back half feels rushed in the actual watching. If anything, the awareness that it might have been working under a tighter clock than the writers wanted is part of why the finale lands as heavily as it does. It's the work of a creative team who knew exactly how much runway they had left and used every inch of it. The finale itself commits to something almost no other animated comedy of its era was willing to commit to. Pops, having finally learned who he truly is, travels with the crew to his home planet of Lollyland and confronts Anti-Pops in a battle the show frames, through the natives of that world, as one that has happened billions of times before and always ended the same way. A stalemate, a mutual blow, a reset. This time, aided by Mordecai and Rigby's intervention after they briefly experience the loop restarting from the show's very first episode, Pops realizes that fighting Anti-Pops the way he always has will only produce the same outcome again. Instead, he pulls his brother into an embrace. Documented directly in the episode and confirmed by cast interviews and reviews from the time, the hug weakens Anti-Pops' accumulated rage, and for a moment he shows genuine remorse for everything he's done, at one point apologizing with a line that's since become one of the most quoted moments of the finale, before the two of them, together, drift into Lollyland's sun and die. Pops's final words to Mordecai and Rigby, delivered telepathically, are that this is a happy ending, that he wants them to take care of each other and to say goodbye for him. The show does not soften this. Pops actually dies. And then, rather than lingering in grief, the finale jumps forward across a set of quiet, warmly staged montages, set famously to David Bowie's Heroes, showing the rest of the cast building ordinary adult lives in the years that follow. Quintel himself, in a panel discussion given around the finale's original airing, described Pops's death as a deliberate way of symbolizing the sadness that comes attached to the kind of maturity the rest of the characters have, by that point, finally reached. Read that way. The show's argument in its very last stretch is that Pops chose the same thing his father figure had been quietly choosing for him his entire life: tenderness, offered even when it costs everything, instead of the cruelty his other half kept offering back. That's a reading, not a line of dialogue the show delivers outright, but it's consistent with how the finale stages the hug, animated with unusual weight by veteran Disney animator James Baxter, as something that looks much more like a long delayed reunion than a final act of combat. A separate, more speculative theory that circulates in fan spaces holds that Pops doesn't fully cease to exist, since he's shown afterward watching his friends from what looks very much like an afterlife on that same VHS tape labeled regular show, ejecting it at the very end and saying simply, "Jolly good show." The show never confirms whether this counts as him coming back, or simply as a gentle final image meant to give the audience somewhere soft to land. Both readings are valid because the show itself refuses to resolve the ambiguity, and that refusal seems, on reflection, entirely intentional. Of everything revealed in the time skip, the detail that produced the most ongoing debate was Mordecai's wife. Steph, the bat he marries after 20 years have passed, receives almost no screen time and is a character the audience has never encountered in any prior season. She isn't Margaret. She isn't CJ. The choice to end his romantic arc with someone entirely new set off a wave of fan argument that, honestly, still hasn't fully cooled down. The more generous reading, and it remains an interpretation rather than a stated fact, is that the show is being deliberately honest about something true for a great many people: that the person who occupied the most emotional real estate in your 20s is often not the person you end up quietly, happily married to 2 decades later. There's also a more cynical reading worth naming plainly, which is that giving Mordecai a brand new partner may simply have been a way of sidestepping the long-running fan argument over whether he belonged with Margaret or with CJ. Without the writers having to pick a side publicly, both readings likely carry some truth. What's documented, rather than argued over, is that both Margaret and CJ appear in the epilogue regardless, present at the reunion alongside everyone else, and that the show treats both breakups, hers and his, with more gentleness than most sitcoms extend to old flames. Anti-Pops, the show's final antagonist, has produced his own small ecosystem of theories, and the most interesting one doesn't treat him as a fully separate being at all. What's canon, again, straight from the show's own dialogue in the finale, is that Anti-Pops and Pops were born from the same source, specifically to balance each other, equal in power, destined to fight. The speculative reading some fans have layered on top of that canon is that Anti-Pops isn't simply Pops's opposite, so much as he's the part of Pops that Pops himself always refused to be. Every time Pops chose kindness instead of cruelty, retreated into his sweet, slightly senile persona instead of confronting the scale of what he actually was, the energy he refused had to go somewhere, and by this reading, Anti-Pops is what accumulates when a being insists on being good for long enough. It's a reading with real emotional resonance, and it lines up neatly with how the final fight is staged, less like a battle between strangers and more like something that finally looks like a long overdue, painful reunion. But it is, without question, an interpretation. The show frames the two of them narratively as brothers and equals, not as two literal halves of one consciousness. And it's worth being honest about that distinction, even while acknowledging why the reading is so tempting. Underneath all of these individual character theories sits what might be the most generous and most frequently cited reading of the entire show. That regular show, at its foundation, isn't really a comedy about supernatural events. It's a comedy about being in your 20s. The argument, made across countless fan essays over the years, is that nearly every monster the show puts in front of Mordecai and Rigby functions as a stand in for something a young adult is actually afraid of. A deadline becomes a literal demon. A mistake becomes a portal to another dimension. A relationship becomes weather. A job becomes a cosmic threat. Read that way, the entire show becomes a recurring dramatization of the anxieties of a generation that grew up on cartoons and then found themselves in their mid 20s in a world that didn't have the shape they'd been promised. Mordecai and Rigby don't really have careers in any conventional sense. They live in a house owned by their employer. They can't quite afford the things they want. They're constantly choosing, in ways the show frames as cosmically consequential, between honesty and avoidance. This reading is speculative in the sense that the show never states it outright as its thesis, but it's consistent enough across all 8 seasons that it functions less like a stretch and more like a pattern the writers clearly understood they were building, whether or not they ever said so publicly. A wide, mostly speculative set of theories connects regular show to the broader Cartoon Network landscape. It aired alongside, most notably Adventure Time and The Amazing World of Gumball, shows that shared a similar era, a similar willingness to take cartoon premises into unexpectedly serious, emotional territory. And in some cases, the same writers, animators, and voice actors moving between projects. There are documented, confirmed crossovers and cameos, small visual nods between shows, and Mordecai and Rigby appearing in things like Uncle Grandpa and The Amazing World of Gumball. The more elaborate version of this theory, entirely fan speculation with no official confirmation, holds that all of these shows share some deeper underlying continuity that the multiverse touched on in regular show's finale connects meaningfully to the multiverses hinted at elsewhere in that era of Cartoon Network programming. The more grounded and probably more accurate reading is that the writers and animators of that period genuinely admired each other's work and slipped in references the way close collaborators do, and that the idea of a unified continuity is a fan project built on top of real affection rather than a secret plan anyone was actually executing. Of all the running motifs across the show, the one fans have built the most theory around is its persistent obsession with the 1980s. The show's whole visual and cultural language leans hard into that decade. The music, the arcade cabinets, the fashion, the synth-driven soundtracks, the giant boomboxes, villains who often seem to be operating from a cultural reference point older than the characters watching them. Creator J. G. Quintel has spoken about this influence in interviews as a genuine artistic choice rather than an accident, and the show is broadly understood, and this part isn't controversial, as a kind of love letter from people who grew up steeped in that decade's culture back to the decade itself. The more speculative reading some fans have taken it toward is that this nostalgia isn't simply warm background texture, but something closer to a kind of haunting, that the park exists at a frequency where old cultural artifacts aren't just memories, but active, present forces capable of reaching back and grabbing hold of the people who loved them. It's a poetic extension of a documented artistic choice, rather than anything the show confirms directly. But it's a durable reading precisely because so many of the show's actual plots do literally involve old arcade cabinets and old pop songs unlocking something dangerous. Eileen is one of the most rewarding characters to apply this kind of reading to because she changes more across the run of the show than almost anyone else in the cast. She begins as a minor character, a quiet, bespectacled mole with a crush on Rigby that the show plays largely for laughs in its earliest seasons, and over time, she becomes one of the most fully realized people in the entire ensemble. What's documented and not up for debate is that by the finale, she and Rigby are married with two daughters, and that her arc across the series is one of consistent, patient honesty. She tells Rigby how she feels long before he's emotionally ready to receive it. She tells him when she's hurt. She tells him when she's happy. The fan reading built on top of that, offered here as interpretation, is that of everyone in the cast. Eileen is the only character who essentially never lies about her own emotional state, and that her steadiness functions as a kind of quiet counterweight to how much of the show's drama comes from everyone else's avoidance. It's a gentle theory more than a controversial one, and it's hard to argue with the way the show simply lets her keep being the steady one across 8 full seasons without ever making a big fuss about it. Death is a recurring character in regular show, and the theories built around him are some of the strangest and gentlest in the fandom at once. He appears as a stylized British biker, complete with leather jacket and motorcycle, has a wife, has a son named Thomas, has an entire set of rules governing when he can and can't take someone, and is, on multiple documented occasions, talked out of a soul through some kind of game or wager. The fan reading here, again speculative, is that his frequent appearances are themselves evidence of how unusual the park actually is, that he keeps returning, because the park keeps producing situations where death becomes, on some level, negotiable, in a way it plainly isn't in the world outside the fence. What's documented is that he's shown attending both Muscleman's wedding and one of Pops's parties, and that he assists the crew during the final battle against Anti-Pops and the show's other late series villain, an entity called Streaming. The interpretation many fans land on, that he keeps returning because he genuinely likes the place, likes the fact that the people there fight him out of love for each other rather than pure fear, is unconfirmed, but consistent with how warmly and how much like an old family friend the show tends to stage him. The question of why regular show actually ended when it did has never been fully resolved by any single official source, and it's produced more competing theories than almost any other piece of behind-the-scenes lore attached to the show. What's documented is straightforward. The 8th and final season was announced by Cartoon Network on the 7th of July, 2015. The writers built the last 2 seasons around a defined ending point, and creator JG Quintel had already begun developing what would become his next series, Close Enough, an adult animated sitcom that would eventually air on a different platform after production wrapped on regular show. That's the confirmed, sourced version of events. The more speculative fan reading, built up over years of interviews and reading between the lines, is that the network's broader programming priorities were shifting during that period, and that the decision to bring the show to a close was shaped at least partly by corporate scheduling rather than purely by creative choice. There's no clean way to verify how much of that is true, but it's worth noting because it directly bears on everything that's happened since, that this reading turned out to be somewhat beside the point. Regular show didn't stay ended. In 2024, at the Annecy Animation Film Festival, Warner Brothers Discovery announced that a new regular show series had been greenlit, with J.G. Quintel returning as showrunner. That series, titled Regular Show, The Lost Tapes, premiered globally on the 11th of May, 2026, with a half-hour special episode, and its very premise turns one of the oldest, most speculative fan theories about the finale into literal, on-screen canon. The framing device of the entire revival is that Pops, in the afterlife, is watching that same VHS tape of regular show that closed out the original finale, and it's revealed that in this afterlife, such a tape is called a memory tape, something a person can revisit whenever they want. When Pops accidentally damages his by rewinding and fast forwarding it too aggressively, he heads to a warehouse full of similar tapes to get it repaired and stumbles instead onto an entire hidden collection buried deep in his own section of the archive. A box of episodes he never got to watch the first time around, labeled, appropriately, The Lost Tapes. Popping one of them in is what actually kicks off the new series. Every episode after that is framed as one of these previously unwatched memories, which means, structurally, that the show can now jump to essentially any point across the original 8 seasons, rather than following a strict forward timeline, since these are gaps in a life already lived, rather than new chapters being added onto the end of it. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it means the single strangest, most quietly devastating image in the entire finale, a God sitting alone somewhere that resembles heaven, watching the life he sacrificed himself to protect play back to him on tape, was never a throwaway detail at all. It was, whether the writers knew it at the time or were simply leaving themselves a door, the actual architecture the show would eventually use to justify coming back. The wiki documents this plainly as the revival's stated premise, not as fan speculation, and creator Quintel has discussed in interviews given around the premiere how deliberately the team designed the first episode specifically to answer, in his words, everybody's questions about how the show could possibly return after ending the way it did, given that one of its central characters had, unambiguously, died. What remains genuinely speculative, because the revival is still airing new episodes as of this recording, is how much further the memory tape framing might eventually be pushed. There's a detail worth flagging directly from the premiere. At the end of Pops's segment in that half-hour special, he appears to still be, in some sense, followed or watched by some kind of presence connected to the memory tapes themselves, and reviewers who covered the premiere have noted that this seems to be setting up a continuing thread in Pops's current-day afterlife storyline, running alongside the new Mordecai and Rigby episodes. Nobody outside the production has confirmed exactly what that thread will become. Some entertainment coverage, published ahead of the premiere, speculated that the revival might function less as a strict continuation and more as an in-betweenquel, slotted into the character's peak years before, the space arc and Pops's death, rather than picking up chronologically after them, specifically because the finale had moved the show so far away from its original small-scale, earth-bound premise that a true continuation would require undoing choices the creative team clearly still stands behind. That speculation lines up with what's actually aired. The confirmed first season includes episodes like Coffee Shop Wars, centered on Margaret and Eileen defending their workplace from a rival coffee shop, and Corpse Flower, built around Margaret's poetry reading colliding with a rare flower blooming the same night, both of which are small, grounded, classic regular show stories, rather than anything that continues the space arc or the cosmic war. The show, In other words, appears to be using its own afterlife framing device to justify going backward into untold moments rather than forward past its own ending, which is either a clever bit of structural humility or a very elegant workaround for a finale the writers clearly have no intention of undoing. Both readings are fair, and it's simply too early, with the revival still mid run, to know for certain which one the show is actually making. What we can say with confidence, because it's documented in reviews from critics who screened the early episodes, is that the tone and format have been kept deliberately close to the original 15-minute episodes. The same core cast, including Mark Hamill, returning as Skips, William Salyers as Rigby, Sam Marin voicing Benson, Pops, and Muscle Man, and Quintel himself back as both Mordecai and High Five Ghost, alongside Minty Lewis as Eileen and Janie Haddad Tompkins as Margaret. Some critics have described the revival as comfortable to the point of being a little too safe, essentially delivering more of exactly what audiences remember rather than pushing the format anywhere genuinely new, while others have praised it specifically for respecting the emotional weight of where the original series ended rather than cheapening it for the sake of easy continuation. It's a mixed critical reception, and that's simply the honest, documented state of things as of this recording. Not a conspiracy theory in itself, though it does mean the show's own afterlife will likely keep growing stranger and more layered the longer the revival continues, and that anyone building fan theories about regular show going forward now has to reckon with a piece of canon that didn't exist even a couple of years ago. A park owner watching his own life on tape quietly being followed by something he doesn't yet understand. Let's go back to the ground level of the show for a while, because there's an enormous amount of smaller, quieter lore that fans have spent years cataloging, and a lot of it deserves attention, even though none of it carries the emotional weight of Pops's death or the finale's structure. Take the house Mordecai and Rigby live in, an old, slightly battered building on the park grounds with an attic, a basement, a living room, bedrooms upstairs, and a kitchen that the show returns to constantly across all 8 seasons. On the surface, it's just a set, but the recurring joke of strange objects turning up inside familiar places, the power discovered in the attic, odd artifacts accumulating in the basement, a fridge that periodically contains things that plainly shouldn't exist, forms a pattern that becomes harder to read as pure coincidence the more episodes you watch. The speculative fan reading is that the house functions almost like a kind of repository, a place where the park quietly stores the cosmic objects it can't afford to simply throw away, and that every time Mordecai and Rigby stumble onto something dangerous inside their own home, they aren't encountering a random plot device so much as the next thing the house has decided, in its own strange way, to surface. Nothing in the show confirms this directly. It remains atmosphere more than argument, but it's a pattern that's genuinely there if you go looking for it. Rigby's own backstory contains a smaller, more grounded pocket of theory, most of it centered on his brother, Don, who is younger, taller, and by most measures more conventionally successful than Rigby, and who the show plays for comedy, but with a level of precision that suggests the writers were taking the underlying family dynamic seriously. The fan reading, offered as interpretation, is that Rigby's entire personality, his slacking, his refusal to take on responsibility, his constant need for Mordecai's approval, is shaped in significant part by growing up in his brother's shadow. What's documented rather than speculative is his eventual arc going back to finish high school in the later seasons, something the show treats with real seriousness rather than as a punchline, culminating in a graduation the show frames as a genuine, hard won triumph rather than a footnote. The reading many fans take from that arc is that Rigby's growth across the series is essentially about learning to stop measuring himself against his brother and starting to measure himself against the person he actually wants to become. And by the finale, married to Eileen and raising two daughters, that arc reads as one of the most fully earned transformations of the entire cast, precisely because it starts from so far behind where it eventually lands. Mordecai's parents deserve a mention too, mostly because of the choice the show made to actually show them on screen as perfectly ordinary, kind, supportive Blue Jays with no dramatic backstory of their own. The fan reading here, again speculative, is that the normality of Mordecai's home life is itself doing quiet thematic work, denying him the easy narrative excuse of a difficult upbringing and framing his particular brand of 20-something paralysis as something that comes from inside him rather than from any external wound. It's a gentler, sharper reading than it sounds at first. The argument being that the writers deliberately chose not to give their main character a traumatic backstory to blame, making his eventual growth entirely his own responsibility rather than the resolution of some inherited wound. The recurring presence of games throughout the show, board games, video game tournaments, eating contests, high scores, wagers with cosmic beings, is itself one of the most consistent structural patterns across all 8 seasons, and once you start counting how often a conflict is resolved this way, rather than through a straightforward fight, it becomes hard to ignore. The reading fans have built around this, purely interpretive, is that the show's universe essentially runs on the logic of contests, that winning the right game can genuinely change what happens, that a wager is treated, functionally, as a kind of contract with reality itself. The Emmy-winning Season 3 episode, Excellent, in which Rigby attempts to eat a giant plate of eggs to win a trucker hat and ends up in a coma, with Mordecai finishing the challenge on his behalf, is frequently cited by fans and critics alike as the show's clearest miniature version of this idea. A hat that's simultaneously meaningless and everything because the show insists that what you're willing to do for a friend matters more than whether the stakes make any logical sense. A darker, quieter corner of the fandom concerns the show's recurring use of possession and Halloween specials, episodes where characters, objects, even the house itself briefly become vessels for something from outside ordinary reality. The wiki documents these plainly as Monster of the Week storylines rather than anything connected explicitly to the show's central cosmology. But the speculative reading many fans hold is that these episodes function as evidence of how thin the boundary around the park actually is, that things from elsewhere keep finding their way in because the park sits on some kind of permeable membrane between worlds. The Halloween specials, in particular, are read by some fans as the moments when the show is, for one night a year, more honest about its own nature than it usually allows itself to be, treating threats with real weight and letting characters actually die within the bounds of the episode in a way the regular season rarely permits. The show's relationship to labor and class is one of the quieter, less flashy conspiracy threads, and it's less about hidden cosmology and more about a pattern of honest observation that many fans feel the show doesn't get enough credit for. The staff of the park are not paid much, live in housing the park itself provides, and are constantly, if comedically, threatened with being fired. Read against that backdrop the show's insistence on treating job loss as a cosmic level stake for its characters starts to look less like an arbitrary joke and more like an accurate reflection of what losing a job that also happens to be your housing would actually feel like for two people with no real financial cushion. It's a reading grounded entirely in what the show plainly shows rather than anything hidden, and it's part of why so many viewers in their 20s and 30s found the show's silliest episodes still oddly true to life. The show's handling of masculinity follows a similar pattern. The main cast is overwhelmingly male, the friendships are mostly male, and across all 8 seasons, nearly every major emotional turning point involves a male character finally saying something honest out loud that he'd been avoiding for a long time. Mordecai eventually tells Margaret what he actually feels. Rigby eventually owns his mistakes rather than deflecting them. Muscle Man mourns his father openly rather than performing toughness through the grief. Pops, in the end, accepts what he actually is instead of hiding inside his gentler, more confused persona. None of this is subtext exactly, since the show plays these moments with clear emotional weight rather than irony, but it is a pattern worth naming directly. A mostly male led cartoon comedy that spent 8 years quietly arguing that learning to say the true thing out loud is the actual cosmic stakes underneath all the monsters. The recurring motif of pairs across the entire series is one of those patterns that, once you notice it, becomes very difficult to stop seeing. Mordecai and Rigby, Pops and Anti-Pops, Skips and his lost love, Mona, Margaret and CJ, Muscle Man and High Five Ghost, Mr. Maylard and Pops, Death and his own family, Eileen and Rigby. The fan reading, built on top of this pattern, offered here plainly as interpretation, is that the show is structurally organized around the idea that two halves of something eventually have to face each other, that nobody in this particular universe grows up entirely alone. Mordecai and Rigby's friendship survives, changed but intact, all the way to the finale. Pops and Anti-Pops don't survive their reunion, but the show frames their ending as closer to reconciliation than defeat. Margaret and CJ each represent one half of a decision Mordecai eventually has to make about what kind of adult he wants to be. It's a satisfying pattern to trace across the show, and it's worth being honest that it's a pattern fans have assembled rather than something the writers have ever confirmed as a deliberate structural choice, but the frequency with which it recurs makes it feel less like a stretch and more like something genuinely embedded in how the show was built. There's also a long-running, more skeptical reading in fan circles that treats regular show almost like a simulation theory thought experiment, pointing to the looping structure of certain plots, the way certain lessons seem to need relearning multiple times across the series, and the way certain threats return in slightly altered forms, as evidence that the characters might be operating inside some kind of test rather than a straightforwardly real world. This is entirely speculative, unconfirmed by the show or the wiki in any way, and it's worth flagging as one of the more far-reaching readings in the fandom rather than something with real textual support. But it's persistent because the show's own time travel episodes genuinely do seem to be internally consistent in a way that rewards close attention, showing futures that match the eventual finale, and pasts that match established backstory without major contradiction, which at minimum suggests the writers were keeping track of continuity more carefully than casual viewing might lead you to assume. The voice cast itself has become its own small pocket of theory, mostly centered on the fact that Sam Marin voices 3 of the show's most emotionally important characters, Benson, Pops, and Muscle Man. That's documented plainly, not speculative in the slightest. What is interpretation is the fan reading that having a single actor carry three of the show's central emotional registers: the angry boss, the gentle heart, the comic performer, functions as a kind of unintentional, or at least unstated structural choice, binding those three characters together on a level beneath the plot itself. It's speculative, since the casting was, by all documented accounts, driven by practical production reasons as much as any creative symbolism, but the effect on screen is undeniable once you notice it. The same human voice, inhabiting three very different relationships to the world around him. The recurring theme of forgiveness across all 8 seasons is one of the more consistent through lines fans have mapped, and it's hard to argue with once you start counting the reconciliation episodes. Brothers who make peace, old friends who patch things up, enemies who reach something like grudging respect. The reading many fans settle on, and it's a reasonable one even without direct textual confirmation, is that the show treats forgiveness as a more powerful force than victory, culminating in the way the finale resolves its central conflict, not through Pops defeating anti-Pops, but through something closer to Pops accepting him. It's a generous reading of the show's own values, and it holds together well against everything else the series does, with its pairs and its recurring insistence that nobody grows up alone. By the time the finale's 20-year time skip plays out, the show has quietly made its argument about what an ordinary, good adult life actually looks like for people like Mordecai, Rigby, and everyone around them. Nobody becomes famous. Nobody becomes wealthy beyond reason. Mordecai paints and marries Steph. Rigby finishes school, marries Eileen, and raises 2 daughters. Muscleman and Starla move into a better trailer and have children who pick up his mannerisms. High Five Ghost and Celia tour as DJs and eventually have a son. Benson inherits the park, reunites with a scientist named Pam, and the two of them marry and take in a small menagerie of pets. Skip simply keeps working at the park, having outlived everyone else by design, trading his usual jeans for jean shorts in one of the show's smallest and gentlest final jokes. The reading many fans have taken from this ending, and it's hard to argue against it given how plainly the show states it, is that this is a deliberate, quiet counter-argument to the way a lot of other shows of its era resolved their characters' arcs. With cosmic ascension or dramatic career triumph, regular show instead gives its cast small, steady, connected lives, and seems to be arguing, gently but insistently, that this is not a smaller outcome than the alternative. It might, in fact, be the actual point the whole show was building toward. The coffee shop deserves its own attention because it functions across the series as a kind of parallel space to the park itself. It's where Margaret works for most of the early seasons, and later where Eileen works too, and it's where Mordecai and Rigby go whenever they need to escape the park's pressures, only to run straight into a different set of pressures entirely. The reading fans have built around it, offered as interpretation rather than anything the show states directly, is that the coffee shop functions as a kind of confessional booth for Mordecai specifically, a place he visits week after week to almost tell Margaret the truth and to fail at it again and again, ordering another coffee instead of saying the thing he actually means. It's a quiet, running joke about how much of early adulthood gets spent in places built to facilitate intimacy without anyone actually getting intimate, and the sharper version of the theory, still speculative, draws a direct line between the coffee shop and the park itself. Both places dressed up as routine. Both places where the actual work that needs doing is not the work anyone is technically there to do. The mall shows up recurringly as a kind of secular mirror to the park, a place where the crew goes to encounter an entirely different flavor of weirdness, one rooted in consumer culture rather than cosmic mythology. The fan reading here treats the mall as the setting for the show's gentle running commentary on how people spend their time and money chasing objects and brands and small obsessions, doing at a commercial scale the same kind of avoidance the park does at a cosmic one. It's speculative in the sense that the show never states this as intentional commentary, but it's consistent with how often Mordecai and Rigby specifically get into trouble there, and how rarely those trips end particularly well for them. Arcade cabinets deserve their own mention too, since the show treats them across many separate episodes as something closer to doorways than to furniture. Garrett Bobby Ferguson, a former video game record holder who becomes a ghost after his first defeat and returns for revenge, is probably the clearest documented example of this pattern, and the fan reading built around him treats his character as an embodiment of the darker side of the show's whole ADS nostalgia obsession. A man who couldn't let a decades-old high score go and let it consume his entire identity in the process. Mordecai and Rigby's repeated victories over him, this reading suggests, function as the show quietly asking its own protagonists, again and again, whether they're willing to grow past the things they were once best at, rather than getting stuck defending a high score from their own youth forever. It's a poetic reading rather than a stated one, but it holds up well against how the show frames his every appearance, treating him as both genuinely funny and, underneath that, faintly tragic. The unicorns who occasionally show up as antagonistic background characters have generated a smaller but distinct pocket of theory centered on class commentary. They're wealthy, vain, and constantly causing minor trouble, and the show treats them with a level of open disdain, unusual even by its own standards. The reading fans have taken from this, purely speculative, is that the unicorns function as a specific kind of satire aimed at comfortable, self-regarding wealth achieved without any of the underlying personal growth the rest of the cast has to work for, essentially functioning as a warning about what Mordecai and Rigby could become if they ever managed to leverage their own slacker tendencies into money without learning anything meaningful along the way. The show never confirms this reading outright, but it's hard to miss how consistently the unicorns lose, and how little affection the writers ever seem to extend them compared to nearly every other recurring character. A quieter, more atmospheric theory concerns the park's various background characters: the snack bar workers, the recurring townspeople, the extras who show up again and again across separate seasons with small, consistent personalities, even though the main cast rarely engages with them directly. The reading here, entirely speculative, is that the park sits at the center of a small, mostly unnoticed community of people whose lives run in parallel to the main cast's without ever fully intersecting, and that the writers built out more of this background world than the show ever had time to properly explore on screen. It's a gentle theory, more about noticing generosity in the writing than uncovering anything hidden, and it's consistent with how the show tends to give even its smallest recurring characters little moments of dignity, rather than treating them as pure scenery. The party planning episodes that recur throughout the run form their own small, interesting corner of theory as well. The structure is reliable. Somebody needs to throw a party. The staff agrees to help. Something supernatural goes wrong, and the party either succeeds against the odds or transforms into a cosmic confrontation that happens to succeed anyway. The reading fans have taken from this pattern, offered as interpretation, is that these episodes are doing the same emotional work as the show's larger battles, just scaled down, testing whether the characters can show up, be present, and be honest with the people around them, on the theory that whether you can let yourself enjoy a birthday is, underneath it, the same kind of question as whether you can let yourself save the world. The Christmas specials and Halloween specials both deserve mention as a matched pair because the show treats holidays with a level of mythological seriousness that exceeds what its own premise would seem to require. Santa, in the Christmas specials, is treated as a real being with real cosmic level power, not a whimsical fiction. And the Halloween specials go even further, staging the membrane between worlds as genuinely thin and dangerous rather than played purely for laughs, with characters actually dying within the bounds of individual episodes. The fan reading built around this, speculative but well supported by tone, is that these specials function as the show's rare moments of full honesty about its own cosmology, confirming that if something like Santa is real in this universe, then the supernatural more broadly isn't the exception here. It's simply, usually, somewhere else. And the holidays are when it briefly comes close enough to see clearly. The original pilot of Regular Show is itself a small, well-documented piece of production history that fans have built genuine theory around. Before the series proper existed, creator J.G. Quintel developed characters for two student films made at the California Institute of the Arts, The Naive Man from Lollyland, released in 2005, and Two in the AM/PM, released the following year. Both films won attention at student festivals, and Quintel has confirmed in multiple interviews that he brought several of those character designs back, specifically because he liked how they'd worked on screen and didn't want to abandon them. Pops, Benson, and Mordecai himself are, by Quintel's own account, the three characters that trace most directly back to those earliest sketches. The show was originally pitched under the working title Normal Show, built around a completely different premise involving zookeepers rather than groundskeepers, before the setting shifted to the park and the title changed to the one it eventually aired under. None of this is speculative. It's documented directly by the creator. What fans have layered on top of it, more speculatively, is the idea that the show's earliest, rougher creative intentions, closer in spirit to late-night sketch comedy than to a children's cartoon, survived only in scattered moments throughout the eventual series, and that the show's gradual turn toward cosmic seriousness in its back half is, in some sense, a delayed attempt to reclaim some of the ground the show gave up in order to be broadcast in the first place. The show's animation style has its own small, devoted pocket of theory built around what it does with proportion and mood rather than plot. The character designs are simple and geometric, while the backgrounds are rendered with a noticeably softer, more hand-painted quality, and the contrast between the two has led some fans to argue that the visual choice is doing more thematic work than it usually gets credit for, making every shot of the park feel a little like a memory of a place rather than a place being witnessed directly in the moment. It's a purely interpretive reading with no direct confirmation from the show's visual team, but it lines up naturally with the broader park as threshold theory that opened this whole video, since a setting that looks slightly like a memory fits comfortably alongside a setting that behaves like one too. The recurring use of the color red throughout the show's design has drawn its own small, careful theory as well. Margaret is associated with red. Auntie Pops is associated with red. A number of the show's villains carry similar color coding. The reading here, speculative but visually supportable, is that red functions almost like a warning color inside the show's own visual language, training the audience without anyone saying so out loud to read it as a signal that whatever's happening carries more emotional or cosmic weight than its surface context suggests, culminating in the finale's visual contrast between Anti-Pops's harsher red tones and Pops's much softer palette. It's a subtle argument, more about pattern recognition than proof, but it's consistent enough across the show's 8 seasons to feel intentional rather than accidental. The eclectic new crew members introduced during the space arc, the various allies the cast picks up once the park becomes a fugitive vessel fleeing across the galaxy, have generated their own smaller conspiracy as well. The reading, entirely speculative, is that these characters aren't simply convenient additions meant to pad out the ensemble for a bigger story, but deliberate echoes of dynamics already established back on Earth, letting the writers test the same emotional structures at a larger, more cosmic scale. There's no confirmation of this from the production side, but it's consistent with how quickly and comfortably these new characters slot into the existing cast, arriving with specific roles and specific emotional beats, rather than feeling like late additions bolted on for scale. The Guardians of Eternal Youth deserve one more look on their own terms, separate from Skips's personal story, because the show quietly builds an entire small cosmology around them that most casual viewers never fully register. They're documented on screen as a group of powerful, immortal beings who resemble large infants with deep voices, capable of flight, telekinesis, and something close to omniscience. And they're the ones who granted both Gary, formerly Gareth, and Skips their immortality. What's also documented and easy to miss on a first watch is that one of them, a guardian named Archibald, is actually killed during the events of Fists of Justice, stabbed by Clorgbane the Destroyer, which means that even a group the show treats as essentially untouchable cosmic royalty has already lost one of its own members by the time the main story catches up with them. The fan reading built around this, entirely speculative, is that the Guardians represent an older, largely unseen order of cosmic caretakers that the park's own staff belong to without fully realizing it. An idea that gains a little more weight once you remember that these same Guardians show up again, fused together with Benson, Eileen, and several other characters into one enormous defensive form to help fight off Antipops and his allies during the finale. It's a reading built on genuine, documented connective tissue rather than pure invention, even if the larger implications remain unconfirmed. Skips's relationship to motorcycles and other vehicles has become its own small, oddly touching corner of fan theory, mostly because of how frequently and how fondly the show stages him with them. The documented backstory gives him a very specific reason to have changed his relationship to walking after Mona's death, and the fan extension of that reading, purely speculative, suggests that his attachment to motorcycles specifically works the same way, representing a kind of motion different enough from walking that it doesn't reopen the same wound, letting him keep moving through the world without ever quite retracing the steps he took the day he lost her. Nothing in the show confirms this directly, but it's consistent with how gently and how repeatedly the show frames his quietest moments alone on the road. Death's family life is one of the more quietly generous details the show includes almost as an aside. He has a wife and a son named Thomas, and the show treats this domestic life as completely unremarkable rather than as some kind of twist, which is itself worth noting. The reading fans have taken from this, offered as interpretation, is that the show is making a small but genuine claim about the personhood of even its most structurally intimidating cosmic figures, suggesting that occupying a role as vast as death doesn't exempt you from also just being a father who worries about ordinary things. It's a gentle theory rather than a dramatic one, and it's consistent with how the show stages death across every one of his appearances. Dignified, a little formal, and clearly fond, in his own way, of the park staff he keeps encountering. The recurring use of time travel across the show is its own corner where fans have built genuinely elaborate theories about continuity. Characters travel forward and back, futures get shown and sometimes changed, past selves get encountered face to face. The reading many fans hold, and it's a reasonable one on close inspection, is that despite how loose and freewheeling the show's use of time travel can feel in any single episode, it holds together with more internal consistency than casual viewing suggests. Since the futures the show glimpses early on tend to actually match what the finale eventually delivers, and the pasts it shows tend to line up with backstory established elsewhere. The more speculative version of this theory treats the time travel episodes almost as the writers letting the audience peek ahead at where the story was always going, long before the space arc made that destination explicit. It's worth being honest that this reading gives the writers a great deal of credit for advanced planning that's difficult to verify from outside the writer's room. But it's also true that the show rarely contradicts its own earlier glimpses of the future in any way that breaks immersion, which is a real and checkable pattern rather than pure wishful thinking. A separate, wide ranging theory holds that the various pieces of pop culture referenced or invented throughout the show, the fictional bands, the fictional films, the posters and action figures scattered through the background of nearly every episode, aren't just throwaway jokes, but a deliberately constructed, alternate pop culture history sitting quietly underneath the main plot. This is speculative rather than confirmed, but it's consistent with how much care the show visibly puts into its band-based and film-based episodes, treating invented franchises with the same detail and internal logic as its cosmic mythology. The reading some fans draw from this, more poetic than provable, is that part of why the show's nostalgia lands so hard is that it isn't only trading on the audience's real childhood memories, it's also built them a fictional childhood alongside their real one, and somehow made both feel equally lived in. One of the more fanciful readings in the entire fandom, never confirmed or denied by the writers in any interview, holds that Mordecai and Rigby function less like two separate characters and more like a single personality split across two bodies, one representing impulse and one representing responsibility, with their friendship dramatizing something closer to internal negotiation than external companionship. It's speculative in the extreme, and the show plainly presents them as two distinct people with two distinct families and two distinct adult outcomes by the finale. But it's worth naming as one of the more poetic threads fans have pulled on, because it does capture something true about how inseparable the show keeps the two of them even after they've built entirely separate lives. Still close, still each other's first call, simply no longer sharing a couch every single night the way they did for most of the series. Which leads naturally into what might be the single most affectionate reading the fandom has produced, treating the entire show underneath every cosmic threat and every supernatural detour as fundamentally a long story about whether two people who grew up together can keep growing without growing apart. It's consistent with everything the show plainly shows. They fight, they make up, they never quite leave, and every near firing across 8 seasons functions as a kind of loyalty test dressed up as workplace comedy. By the time the finale arrives, and both of them have built full, separate adult lives that still clearly orbit each other, This reading holds up about as well as any theory in the entire fandom, precisely because it requires the least speculative leap of all of them. Everything else in the show, the cosmic war, the space arc, the layered mythology, can reasonably be read as the elaborate, strange, genuinely moving decoration built around that one much simpler question. Zooming back out to the revival for a moment, because it's still airing and still shaping how all of this material gets read going forward, it's worth noting the specific structural freedom the Lost Tapes has given itself by framing every new episode as a previously unwatched memory rather than a forward continuation. Because Pops is retrieving these tapes from his own archive in whatever version of an afterlife the show has settled on, the series isn't bound to unfold chronologically at all, and creator Quintel has said directly in interviews that the plan going forward includes giving more screen time to side characters beyond Margaret and Eileen, exploring backgrounds and personal stories the original run never had room for. That's a documented statement of creative intent rather than speculation, and it dovetails naturally with one of the oldest fan theories in this entire video: the idea that the park's world was always bigger and more populated than any single season had time to show. The revival, whether or not it was designed with that specific fan reading in mind, is now functionally in a position to go looking for exactly the kind of unexplored corners fans have spent a decade imagining were there all along, which is a strange and rather lovely bit of alignment between what audiences hoped for and what the show has actually, structurally, set itself up to deliver. Margaret's eventual decision to leave the park behind and pursue journalism school is worth pausing on separately from her role in Mordecai's love triangle, because it's one of the quietly maturest choices the writers make across the whole run. After years of being tied, narratively, to Mordecai's feelings, the show lets her simply leave to build a life of her own, treating the decision with a level of seriousness that reportedly surprised some viewers when it originally aired. The reading many fans take from this, and it holds up well against how her later guest appearances are handled, is that most workplace sitcoms would have kept a character like Margaret orbiting the male lead indefinitely for the sake of ongoing romantic tension, and that letting her go instead is a small act of respect, both for the character and for the audience, acknowledging that she was always a full person with her own ambitions, rather than a permanent fixture of somebody else's story. CJ's slower, messier fade from Mordecai's life reads as a kind of companion piece to Margaret's cleaner departure. She's volatile, she loves intensely, the relationship is genuinely stormy, and when it ends, the show lets it end, without turning her into a villain for it. The reading fans have settled on, purely interpretive, is that CJ represents a particular kind of relationship a lot of people have once in their 20s and then carry afterward as a kind of permanent weather pattern, and that the show is being honest about the fact that the most emotionally intense relationship of a given decade of your life is often not the one you end up building anything lasting with. The show's relationship to slowness and ordinary time is one of its most loved qualities, and also one of the hardest to pin down with any single piece of evidence, since it's a matter of pacing and tone rather than any specific line or reveal. Despite its cosmic stakes, the series is paced, especially in its earlier seasons, like a long, unhurried afternoon full of scenes where characters are simply sitting together, doing nothing in particular, before the plot escalates into something stranger. The reading many longtime viewers hold, offered here as interpretation of tone rather than anything the show states directly, is that regular show is less an action comedy, interrupted occasionally by stillness, and more a comedy of leisure interrupted occasionally by action, which goes a long way toward explaining why so many people specifically use it, the way you might be using this very video right now, as something to fall asleep to. It's paced like an evening where you don't have anywhere else to be, and that rhythm seems, on reflection, like a genuine artistic choice rather than an accident of the format. It's worth closing this particular thread by noting how deliberately self aware the show became about its own audience by the time it reached its final stretch, and how the revival seems to be continuing that same instinct rather than abandoning it. A show built this carefully around long, patient evenings, around two people slowly learning to say the true thing out loud, around forgiveness treated as more powerful than victory, was always going to attract exactly the kind of viewer who comes back to it years later, looking for the same comfort, and exactly the kind of viewer who finds it for the first time at an hour like this one and stays up far later than planned because the park somehow still feels like somewhere worth visiting. The recurring threat of the park itself being sold, demolished, or otherwise shut down is its own small, consistent thread across the series, and the fan reading built around it treats these threats as structural rather than random, a repeated way of testing how attached the staff actually are to a place they spend most of their time pretending not to care about. Each time the park is threatened, the crew answers the same way. They show up, they embarrass themselves, they risk what little stability they have to keep it standing, and the show treats that yes, every time, as a small triumph rather than a foregone conclusion. It's an interpretive reading rather than anything stated outright, but it's consistent with how the show frames the staff's loyalty throughout its run, more through action than through anything anyone actually says out loud. They complain constantly. They slack whenever they can get away with it, and every single time the park is actually in danger, they show up anyway, which by the time you reach the space arc and the park's literal, physical survival is at stake, reads less like a coincidence and more like the show's clearest possible way of proving a point it never needed to say in dialogue. That, in the end, might be as close as any single thesis gets to holding all of this together. Whatever conspiracy you're drawn to most, the cosmic mythology, the quiet grief underneath Benson's temper, the long shadow Muscle Dad's lie casts over his son, the sense that Skips has been quietly running the wheel for far longer than anyone else in the cast understands, or the very new, very real fact that Pops is now, canonically, sitting somewhere in an afterlife rewatching his own life on tape. All of it points back to the same, small, patient argument the show has apparently been making since its very first episode. That showing up for the people around you, in a job you didn't choose, in a decade of your life that doesn't look the way you thought it would, is its own kind of cosmic stakes, whether or not anyone ever calls it that out loud. There's one last reading worth sitting with before we let the park settle for the night, and it's the most tender one the fandom has produced. Across its 8-year run, and now again in its ongoing revival, regular show seems to have understood exactly what kind of viewer it was making itself for. Someone in their 20s, watching alone late at night, letting the cosmic threats function as a kind of dream logic, sitting on top of much smaller, much more real, emotional work. The argument, and it remains an argument rather than anything the show has ever stated as an explicit goal, is that the writers were thinking carefully about that particular viewer, trying to leave them slightly more able to face their own life at the end of each episode than they'd been at the start of it. It's the most generous reading in the entire fandom, and also maybe the hardest one to prove, but it's consistent with the fact that people who watched the show as 20 somethings are now, provably, coming back to it in their 30s and 40s, looking for the same comfort it gave them the first time, and that a whole new generation is now discovering it fresh through a revival built, quite literally, around the idea of a life being rewatched on tape. Whether you read Regular Show as a workplace comedy with cosmic flourishes, a story about the difficulty of growing up without growing apart, a quiet argument about forgiveness, or a very long, patient act of company for anyone watching alone at night, the show seems willing to hold all of these readings at once without contradicting itself. The park is a hiding place and a threshold, and a community and a job. Pops is a god and a son and a friend, and by his own account, a fan of the tape of his own life. Skips is a guardian and a widower and a coworker who kept skipping for 150 years so he'd never forget one specific afternoon. Mordecai is a slacker and a romantic, and a young man, slowly, awkwardly, learning to be present inside his own life. The wiki documents the canon. Everything else, the interpretations, the conspiracies, the readings fans keep building and rebuilding, supplies the rest, and the space between what the show plainly shows and what it quietly allows you to notice is where Regular Show has always actually lived. It started as a slacker comedy about a blue jay and a raccoon avoiding lawn work, and it ended, somehow without ever betraying itself along the way, as a cosmic story about sacrifice and love and the specific difficulty of staying close to the people you grew up with. It grew the way its own characters grew, slowly, a little awkwardly, occasionally painfully, and always with real affection underneath the jokes. And now, years after it first ended, it's back, framed as the tape's its own gentlest character never got to watch the first time, which might be the most fitting way any show has ever found to justify coming home again. If you grew up with the park the first time around, you already know what it feels like to walk back into it. If you're finding it for the first time tonight through this video, you have years of company ahead of you. The staff will still be there. The cosmic threats will still pass through and get handled before the credits roll. The afternoons will still be soft. Somewhere in an attic, a keyboard that once bent reality is gone now, spent in the last fight that mattered. Somewhere on a quiet road, an immortal man is still skipping instead of walking, because that's what he chose a very long time ago, in the one moment that decided the rest of his life. And somewhere, on a shelf in a warehouse that looks a little like heaven, there's a box of tapes still left to watch. If this kind of deep dive is the sort of thing that helps you drift off, go ahead and hit subscribe. It genuinely helps this channel keep making them. And if you made it this far tonight, you already know where you are. You've spent the last couple of hours back inside a place you may not have thought about in years, walking slowly through everything hidden behind the trees and the windows and the smiles of the people who work there. And if that's done its job tonight, you're probably somewhere between awake and asleep right now, which is exactly where a video like this one is supposed to leave you. Sleep well. Take whatever the park gave you tonight along with you. The wiki will keep updating in some tab somewhere. The tapes, apparently, are still being found, and the part of you that loved this show the first time around, whenever that was for you, is going to keep being one of the better parts of you. The park will still be there when you come back to it.